Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
English votes for English laws. That was the mechanism introduced by David Cameron's government to answer concerns about the ability of Scottish MPs to veto legislation that applied only to England following devolution. It's known at Westminster by the menacing-sounding acronym EVEL, E-V-E-L, and it's been in place for a year. Theresa May's government says it's going to review the mechanism this autumn. So what exactly is it, and is it working? Here's Joko with the details.
Yes, well, think back 2 years ago to the morning after the Scottish independence referendum. David Cameron stood on the steps of Downing Street and said new powers for Scotland should be balanced by English votes for English laws. EVEL. There was an attempt to answer the so-called West Lothian question, which concerns Scottish MPs voting on matters that don't affect Scotland. Under rules introduced last October, the Speaker, John Bercow, now decides if each new law applies only to England and Wales, or the whole UK. A new stage in the lawmaking process was also created, the Legislative Grand Committee, where only MPs from the relevant nations can vote. The changes came into effect in January. So far, the Speaker has certified 11 bills under what is known as EVEL, including on housing and policing and crime. And there have been 14 divisions on other pieces of legislation in which only English or English and Welsh MPs have taken part. But the controversy hasn't gone away. The government was forced to shelve a vote last summer on relaxing the fox hunting ban in England and Wales after the Scottish National Party pledged to vote against the proposals. Now there are suggestions the SNP could also attempt to block Theresa May's plans for grammar schools in England. And the government is now carrying out a review of the process. Leader of the Commons, David Lidington, told MPs the details will be published later this year. Andrew.
Thanks, Joko. Well, to discuss this, we're joined by the Conservative MP, Chris Philp, and of course, John Nicholson of the SNP is still here. So, Chris Philp, is it working?
Well, it's a good start in the sense that it now means for the first time English MPs have effectively a veto over measures that affect England only, which didn't exist before. And it's a small step to correct the unfairness, the West Lothian question famously posed by Tam Dael, whereby Scottish MPs in Westminster can vote on matters that affect only England, but English MPs don't have the reciprocal right.
When you say a veto by English members, what do you mean? I thought the purpose was not a veto, but to make sure that purely English matters, it was only English MPs that voted on them.
Well, I think it's still subject to a vote by the whole House subsequently. So even if English members vote for something, it could still be voted down by the House as a whole. That hasn't happened so far, but it is a power of veto, not a power to positively legislate.
The rescinding the ban on fox hunting, which I think was only for England, or England and Wales, the government withdrew that when the SNP said they'd vote against it. Isn't that a huge hole in the middle of what you're trying to do?
Yeah, because in that situation, if the whole House, including the SNP, could vote against it, then it wouldn't progress. And I mean, Nicola Sturgeon said very clearly in February 2015 in The Guardian that the SNP members would not be voting on English-only matters, and she even explicitly mentioned fox hunting as an example of where they wouldn't vote. But come July 2015, just a few months later, she did a 180-degree U-turn and suddenly decided that actually fox hunting in England was of such critical importance in Scotland, they would vote on it after all, which I think is pretty shamelessly opportunistic.
What was the logic of the SNP voting on rescinding the ban on fox hunting in England? Were you worried that you'd be inundated by fleeing foxes into Scotland?
I was inundated with Tory MPs asking us to vote on that, actually, because I think what a lot of people don't realise is just how many Conservative MPs are opposed to blood sports. So a number of them said they really hoped that we would vote, said that to me privately. You're absolutely right, Nicola Sturgeon did say that, and she did change her mind on it, which I think politicians are allowed to do. My view was I'm very strongly against blood sports. I thought we were right to say that we'd vote on it. And although you mention foxes crossing the border in jest, of course foxes and the hunts themselves don't respect the border, and they do cross backwards and forwards across the border.
That's a policing matter, isn't it?
Well, it's all a policing matter ultimately, isn't it?
There used to be a rule which was broadly adhered to by the Scottish nationalists, that you didn't vote on what you would regard as English-only matters.
Yes.
That seems to have gone by the wayside. What's the rule now?
Well, I think we do, broadly speaking, have a self-denying ordinance. Since I've been in the House of Commons, the issue has always been whether or not it has a knock-on financial effect, with the exception of the fox hunting one that you raised. And I've said to you why we said that we would vote on that, and you couldn't have carried, as I said, the Tory backbenches on it anyway in their entirety. But it tends to be things that have a Barnett consequential are the things that we say we'll vote on.
So if it comes to the House, will you vote on Mrs May's plans for grammar schools for England?
I don't know yet. That will depend on whether or not we decide that there are financial implications or not.
What if it's just done within the existing education budget, or a bit more is added to the education budget to create these schools, which of course you would get benefit from, even though you won't be introducing grammar schools? So where would the negative consequential be on this?
I would have to see the detail of it, which I don't yet know. So, in answer to your question, I don't know how we're going to vote on that.
You kind of make it up as you go along now, don't you?
Well, no, really. The financial the financial implications are the key. Well, can you point me to any other examples?
Well, there's all sorts of things that
the
SNP
has intervened.
No, but
not in our voting record over the last year.
Well, Sunday Trading, you were accused of intervening on something that you turned into an opportunistic example of interfering in votes that wouldn't affect you directly.
As far as I know, Sunday Trading did not go beyond preliminary discussions.
But there was a vote on it, and the SNP voted against the government's motion. In fact, I was one of the MPs voting for it, and as a result, Sunday trading laws in Croydon, which I represent, have been affected by your vote. But I don't get to vote on Sunday trading in your constituency. It's just not fair, is it? And there was no Barnett consequential at all. These Barnett consequentials are effectively made up as a tiny fig leaf to excuse basically troublemaking.
Well, I love the fact if we don't help you get your legislation through, we're troublemakers. Your problem is, on the various issues that you've raised, you can't carry your backbenches. A lot of your backbenches are very hostile. It is his problem.
And you know what? It's not your job to help the Tory party.
Well, absolutely not.
So why are you making the point?
Because he's talking as if the Conservative Party is entirely united on these issues.
Well, that's not the point.
And it's only a bunch of troublemakers in the SNP who thwart you.
Well, let me ask you this. Let me ask you, because it could be an issue coming out. We don't know if it's going to come before the Commons yet. But would you accept that if a vote on grammar schools comes before the Commons, and it is clearly only for England, I don't even think it covers Wales, it's clearly an English-only matter, that if the Scottish nationalists are able to vote under the EVEL rules, then there's a coach and horse through EVEL that makes it irrelevant?
Well, it was only ever a veto, but it would certainly expose the weakness you're referring to, which is that English MPs acting alone can't positively get something through, and it might make the case to strengthen the reform, to make it not just a power of veto, but a power of sort of proposition and legislation as well, so where the Scots didn't have a veto. But on that fox hunting point, actually, I think I may well have voted, well, I may well have actually voted against it, as you did, or as you would have done, but that isn't the point. The point is, it's not fair for Scottish MPs to vote on matters that don't affect them at all.
We understand that's the principle. Can I just clarify, is it your desire to toughen this up?
Well, I think there is a case for looking at that, but let's just see how the SNP behave in practice. I don't like tinkering with our constitution unnecessarily, and I think if the SNP
You're always tinkering with it.
So, well, I'm not. I'm just a backbench MP.
But your governments are always tinkering with it.
But look, I think if the SNP respect the spirit of what's intended and leave the grammar school legislation and similar things alone, then I think we can say the system is working. If, on the other hand, they sort of abuse the current arrangements, and I would put it as strongly as abuse, then I think we would need to look at it again. Yes.
Not sure whether that's a perverse incentive or an incentive.
I'm trying to work that out myself, actually.
As to what you should do. But because it's very complicated, this EVEL business. I think it was William Hague that put it together, and of course he's not there anymore. What would be wrong? If this is the way you want to go, whether you do or not is another, whether that's right is another matter, but if this is the way you wanted to go, what would be wrong with the Speaker designating a bill as England only, and you simply say Scottish MPs cannot vote on that matter?
Well, that's effectively what I'm suggesting we'd need to look at if they, as it were, misbehave and abuse the current system. The danger, of course, is you then start creating an English Parliament sort of by the back door, and it is a complicated
what would be wrong
issue.
with that?
Exactly.
Well, I mean, you need to think carefully before you, as I say, tinker with the Constitution. It's quite
Wales has got a Parliament.
Well,
We're all being moved. We're all being moved out
Some-
of the crumbling old House of Commons.
Well,
This is a perfect time for you to set up an English Parliament, which would resolve this issue.
and place it in the north of England.
And even more fabulous.
Some people would say we've got enough politicians and enough parliaments already without creating
could cut
a load
down the
more.
number.
Well, we've enough
Yeah.
lords, but you're very keen in creating more lords. You've got more lords now than MPs. Cut them.
Isn't it inevitable, whether or not Scotland ends up independent, and we're going to talk about that later, the whole trend of British constitutional policy is for further devolution. Devolution to Scotland, more powers for Wales, Northern Ireland, even devolution to some extent, though it's more administrative, within England itself, the Manchester powerhouse and all the rest of it. If that's the direction of travel, which seems clear and has been since before Mr. Blair, would it not make sense to look at an English Parliament?
Well, as I say, I think you mess
Or a version of?
Well, you mess around with the Constitution, I think with caution. These are complicated, long-standing traditions. We do have enough politicians and parliaments already. Local councils, county councils, the Westminster
I know
Parliament.
what we've got.
There's a huge number already. And I mean, the reason that the SNP are keen to see an English Parliament, of course, is because they think it'll unpick the ties that
No, I
bind
just
the
think
union.
it's a good idea.
You're not giving. I don't think you're giving me friendly advice. I think you're trying to
I don't think
unpick
either of
the
you are
ties.
giving friendly advice. Anyway, we've run out of time.
I'm just saying it's a good idea.
We will no doubt come back to it. You say EVEL and I say evil.
I know, evil sounds less sinister than evil.
I like that.
Potato, potato.
And anyway, you don't spell evil like that.
I've been getting away with it all my